I saw a ghost at an abandoned house in the woods. I never considered myself someone who believed in ghosts. Sure, I'd heard all the stories. Creepy local legends about haunted houses, the typical small-town rumors. But I never gave them much thought. That is, until the day I stepped inside the old house in the woods. The one no one dared talk about anymore. The one that still makes me uneasy every time I think about it. It's been over 15 years, and I still don't know what happened that day. But I do know this. We weren't alone in that house. Growing up in a sleepy town like ours, you had to make your own fun. My best friend Mike and I spent most of our summers roaming the woods behind our neighborhood. There wasn't much else to do. We'd hike, fish, sometimes build forts out of sticks and leaves like we were still little kids. Looking back, it seems kind of ridiculous. But at the time, it was freedom. We were always looking for new places to explore, something to push the boundaries of boredom. That's how we first heard about the house. It wasn't like the place was some big secret. If you grew up in our town, you knew the story. There was this old abandoned house deep in the woods, past the hiking trails and far beyond where most kids were allowed to go. Supposedly, an old lady had lived there alone for years, and people whispered that she was some kind of witch or recluse. The story was always vague, but the legend stuck. She died in the house, and no one had lived there since. It was left to rot, overtaken by the forest, and everyone knew to stay away. At least that's how the story went. Most of us just thought it was one of those exaggerated local myths that kept kids from wandering too far into the woods. I never really believed any of it, and neither did Mike. But that summer, we were looking for something to do, something to break the monotony of endless afternoons spent walking the same paths and seeing the same trees. So, when Mike suggested we go find the old house, I shrugged and agreed. It wasn't that I was particularly brave, but the idea of exploring somewhere new, somewhere forbidden, was enough to get me on board. We told ourselves it was just a stupid dare. Go to the house, maybe snap some pictures, then head home with a good story to tell our friends. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. We set out one morning, following an overgrown trail that snaked deeper into the woods than we'd ever gone before. The first few hours were uneventful, just the usual sounds of the forest. Birds chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I remember the sun was shining and everything seemed peaceful, normal. But as we got closer, the atmosphere changed. The trees grew thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight, and the air felt heavier, like we had crossed some invisible line into a different world. I tried to shake the feeling, chalking it up to nerves. After all, we were on edge from all the talk about the house, and I figured my mind was just playing tricks on me. Then we saw it. The house wasn't exactly what I expected. It was worse. More like a skeleton of a house, really. The roof sagged in places, and most of the windows were broken, their jagged edges framed by vines and overgrown ivy. The paint, what little was left, had peeled away long ago, leaving the wood exposed to the elements. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, just like everyone said. For a moment, I considered turning back. There was something about the place that felt wrong. But Mike was already walking toward it determined as ever, and I wasn't about to be the coward who backed out. So I followed. We pushed open what was left of the front door, which groaned on its hinges and nearly came off entirely. Inside, the house was exactly what you'd expect from a place left to decay for years. Dust thick enough to choke on, cobwebs in every corner, and the smell of rot hanging in the air. We crept through the entryway, our footsteps echoing on the creaky wooden floorboards. "Man, this place is trashed," Mike said, his voice louder than it should have been in the eerie stillness. I nodded, not really paying attention to his words. Something about the house had me on edge, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was more than just the dilapidated state of the place. It felt like we were being watched. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, but the feeling wouldn't go away. We wandered through the rooms, trying to make a joke out of it. We laughed at the faded floral wallpaper and the ancient, broken furniture left scattered around. But the laughter felt forced, hollow, like we were trying too hard to convince ourselves that everything was fine. Then we reached the stairs. They led up to a second floor, the banister leaning dangerously to one side. Mike, being Mike, decided to go first. I hesitated but followed him up, each step creaking louder than the last. The upstairs was somehow worse than the downstairs. Dustier, darker, the light from the broken windows barely reaching into the hall. That's when I saw it. Or thought I did. It was just a shadow, really, at the far end of the hallway, near a door that hung slightly ajar. I couldn't make out much, a shape, a figure maybe, but it was enough to make my heart race. "Did you see that?" I whispered, stopping dead in my tracks. Mike looked at me, confused. "See what?" "There, by the door." I pointed, but the hallway was empty now. Nothing but shadows and dust motes floating in the dim light. Mike shrugged. "Probably just your imagination, dude. This place is creepy enough to make anyone jumpy." I wanted to believe him, but something about that shadow didn't sit right with me. It had felt too real, too solid. We moved down the hallway toward the room at the end, and the air felt colder the closer we got. Mike pushed open the door, and we both froze. Inside, the room was mostly bare, except for an old rocking chair in the corner, and it was moving, rocking slowly back and forth, even though there was no wind, no reason for it to move. My stomach dropped, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "What the hell?" Mike whispered, his voice shaking for the first time since we'd entered the house. We stood there, staring at the chair, both of us too afraid to move. Then, from behind us, we heard a sound. A soft, shuffling noise, like footsteps on the old wooden floor. We turned at the same time, and that's when we saw her. An old woman, standing at the far end of the hallway. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and she was wearing a tattered dress that looked like it belonged in another century. She didn't move, didn't say anything, but her eyes, those dark, sunken eyes, were locked on us. Mike didn't wait. He grabbed my arm and yanked me toward the stairs, pulling me along as we bolted down them, our footsteps echoing like gunshots in the silence. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. I could feel her behind us, watching. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, crashing through the woods, branches whipping at our faces, breath ragged in our chests. Only when we reached the edge of the forest did we stop, gasping for air. Neither of us said a word for a long time. Finally, Mike looked at me, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" "I didn't know. I still don't." After that day at the house, things didn't go back to normal as easily as I'd hoped. It wasn't like Mike and I had some big dramatic conversation about what we saw, or thought we saw. In fact, we barely talked about it at all. The few times we tried, it was like our words didn't fit the experience. They felt clumsy, too small to capture the feeling of terror that had gripped us in that moment. We chalked it up to our nerves. Maybe the house was just old, and the shadows played tricks on our minds. Maybe the creaky floorboards and the rocking chair were just the result of wind, or the house settling, even though neither of us really believed that deep down. But the rational explanations were easier to live with, so we stuck with them. We convinced ourselves that whatever happened wasn't anything supernatural. We were just a couple of dumb teenagers who got spooked, så att, Schroter at, Trancharcherin and Torturam, Cernal Sir Saladbram, for Maine, Sir Isir all also. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the house anymore, it was the woods. The same woods Mike and I had wandered through countless times now felt different. Like they were watching us, waiting. I could barely bring myself to walk the old trails anymore. Even the breeze that rustled the trees seemed strange, like a whisper I couldn't quite catch. I didn't tell Mike how I felt, though. He'd only laugh and say I was being paranoid, and maybe I was. But one night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something that snapped me wide awake. At first, it was soft, a faint, creaking noise, like the sound of a rocking chair gently swaying back and forth. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, listening hard. The sound was distant, barely there, but unmistakable. I tried to convince myself that it was the wind, or maybe the house settling. But the longer I listened, the more it started to feel like I was back in that room, standing frozen in front of that old chair. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the house setting my nerves on edge. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I finally drifted off to an uneasy sleep, plagued by dreams of that woman, her hollow eyes watching me from the shadows. The next time I saw Mike, I was determined to bring it up. We met at our usual spot, the small clearing just past the edge of the woods where we'd built a rickety wooden fort years ago. Mike was acting like everything was fine, like nothing had changed. But I couldn't let it go. The creaking noise from that night kept playing in my head, and I had to know if I was the only one who was still haunted by it. "Have you been thinking about the house?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Mike shrugged, tossing a stick into the underbrush. "Not really, I mean, it was creepy, sure, but it was just an old house, right?" "Yeah, I guess." I hesitated, then added, "But have you heard anything strange? Like, at night?" He looked at me with a raised eyebrow. "What, like ghosts?" I didn't want to sound ridiculous, but I pushed ahead. "I heard something the other night. It sounded like the rocking chair, the one in the house." Mike's face darkened for a split second, a flicker of unease crossing his features, but he quickly brushed it off. "Man, you're just psyching yourself out. Houses creak, wood shifts, and your brain is playing tricks on you, that's all." Maybe he was right. But something in his voice told me he wasn't as convinced as he pretended to be. As the weeks passed, the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. I started seeing things, little flashes of movement out of the corner of my eye, usually when I was alone in the woods or walking home at dusk. Once, while cutting through the woods, I could have sworn I saw someone standing far off in the trees, just watching. It was a fleeting glimpse, and when I turned to get a better look, no one was there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been there, just beyond my line of sight. Mike was starting to avoid the subject altogether. Anytime I brought up the house or the woman, he changed the topic or laughed it off, but I could tell he wasn't sleeping well either. There were dark circles under his eyes and he seemed jumpier than usual. He'd dismiss my concerns, but there were moments when I'd catch him staring off into the woods, his jaw tight, like he was waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. Then came the night. I knew I wasn't imagining things. It was late, and I had just gotten into bed. The house was quiet, the kind of deep, still silence that usually made me feel safe. But not that night. Just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. That slow, rhythmic creaking, like a rocking chair swaying back and forth. Only this time, it was louder, closer. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The sound was coming from right outside my window. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I slowly got out of bed and crept toward the window. My hand shook as I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. The backyard was empty, just the familiar outline of trees against the night sky. But the rocking sound was still there, louder now, as if it was right behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone in my room, but it was empty. The air felt thick, heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on me. I could barely breathe. That's when I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, I told Mike we needed to go back to the house. He didn't like the idea. He flat out refused at first, but I convinced him. We needed to know if it was all in our heads or if something had really followed us out of that place. I didn't say it out loud, but I think we both knew what we were really afraid of, that maybe we had brought something back with us. The hike to the house felt longer this time, every rustle of the leaves sending a shiver down my spine. Mike was unusually quiet, his usual bravado completely gone. When the house finally came into view, it was just as decrepit as before, but now it seemed darker, like the shadows inside had thickened in our absence. We stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the house, neither of us willing to move forward. Mike broke the silence first. "Maybe this was a bad idea," he muttered, his voice barely audible. I didn't disagree, but we were already there, and I needed to see it through. I needed to know if what we saw that day, the woman, the rocking chair, was real, or if it was just some shared hallucination brought on by fear. We stepped inside the house, the floorboards groaning under our weight just like before. The same dust, the same decay. But this time, there was something else. A smell, damp and musty, like something that had been left to rot for far too long. Nugget! We made our way back to the room with the rocking chair. It was still there, in the corner, but this time, it wasn't moving. The air in the room felt thick, like we were standing in a vacuum. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. Then we heard it. A soft, shuffling sound from upstairs, followed by the faintest creak of the floorboards. It was enough to send us both running without a word. We didn't look back. After that second trip to the house, Mike and I didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. The moment we ran out of there, our unspoken agreement was clear. Whatever was happening in that place, whatever we had seen or heard, it was real enough to us. There was no point in trying to rationalize it anymore. We stopped hanging out near the woods, the places we used to roam, our old fort, the trails we knew by heart, felt tainted, like the house had infected the entire forest. Every time I passed by the tree line on my way to school, or when walking home, I couldn't help but feel watched. That same heaviness from the house seemed to settle over the woods, like an invisible presence lurking just out of sight. But the strangest part wasn't what happened in the house. It was what happened after. For a while, things were quiet. The nightmares stopped, or at least they became less frequent. I stopped hearing the creaking of the rocking chair in the middle of the night. It was like whatever had been haunting me had retreated, as if leaving the house alone had been enough to stop it from following us further. Mike, however, wasn't doing as well. He started skipping school, and when we did hang out, he seemed distant, distracted. The same guy who had always been the brave one, the one pushing me to take risks, now seemed hollowed out. He wouldn't talk about the house, and any time I brought it up, he'd change the subject or brush me off with a quick, "Forget about it, man." It wasn't like him to let things go, and that only made me worry more. It was clear the house was still messing with his head, even if he didn't want to admit it. I tried to check in on him, but there was this wall between us now, something we couldn't get past. That's when I realized that the house had taken more from us than just a creepy experience. It had changed something in our friendship, something I wasn't sure we'd ever get back. A few weeks later, I got a call from Mike in the middle of the night. I hadn't spoken to him in over a week at that point, which wasn't like him. When I picked up the phone, he sounded out of breath, panicked. "I went back," he said, his voice shaky. I sat up in bed, instantly alert. "What do you mean you went back? To the house?" He didn't answer right away, just took a few deep breaths like he was trying to calm himself down. I thought if I went back alone, I could figure it out. I could end it. My heart sank. "Mike, what did you see?" There was a long pause, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, almost a whisper. "She was there, in the same room, just standing there. She didn't move, didn't say anything, but I knew. I knew she was waiting for me." "Mike, you need to stay away from that place," I said, my voice more urgent than I intended. We both do. Whatever's in that house, we're not supposed to mess with it." "I know," he muttered, sounding defeated. "I just thought I could fix it, you know? That I could stop whatever this is." The call ended not long after that. I tried to convince him to come over, to stay the night at my place, but he brushed me off, saying he was fine. But I could hear it in his voice. He wasn't fine. The next day, I went over to Mike's house hoping to talk to him face to face, but when I got there, his mom told me he wasn't home. She looked concerned, saying she hadn't seen much of him lately. My stomach tightened. I knew where he'd gone. I headed straight for the woods. It was early afternoon, but the sky was overcast, casting everything in a dull, gray light. As I made my way through the familiar trails, I kept telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that Mike was fine, that he wasn't stupid enough to go back to the house again after what happened the night before. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread building in my chest. When I reached the clearing, the house stood there, like a rotten skeleton, exactly as we'd left it. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, half expecting to see Mike already waiting there. But the place was silent, and he was nowhere in sight. I didn't want to go inside. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to leave this place behind for good. But I couldn't shake the image of Mike standing in that room alone, facing whatever was waiting for him. I stepped inside the house, the floorboards creaking beneath me like they had before. The air was thick with the same musty smell, and the dim light filtering through the broken windows gave the whole place a claustrophobic feel. My footsteps echoed as I made my way toward the room with the rocking chair, the same room where we had seen her. The chair was there, still and empty, but Mike wasn't. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the empty chair, half expecting it to start moving on its own. But the house was silent. The woman wasn't there, and neither was Mike. I turned to leave, my heart hammering in my chest, when I heard something. A faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the floor. I froze, fear gripping me as I slowly turned back toward the doorway. But no one was there. The hallway was empty. That's when I realized the house had never wanted Oos. Not really. It didn't need Oos to stay. All it needed was for Oos to bring it with us, into our minds, into our nightmares. And now, standing there, I understood that the house wasn't just a place. It was a presence, something that had followed us out of the woods that first day. And it wasn't done with us. Mike stopped answering my calls after that. He moved away the following summer, and we eventually lost touch. I don't know where he went, and part of me wonders if he's still trying to outrun whatever we woke up in that house. As for me, I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't hear the rocking chair at night anymore, and the nightmares have mostly faded. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel it. That heavy, suffocating presence. Like the house is watching me, waiting for me to come back. The truth is, I don't know what we saw in that house. Maybe it was real, maybe it wasn't. But I do know this. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed, and some questions are better left unanswered. Because once you see something like that, once it gets into your head, it never really leaves.